All right. Game of the year winner is Elden Ring.
In December of 2022, at the annual Game Awards, the open world role-playing game Elden Ring won not only Game of the Year, but also Best Narrative. Within the video game community, the nomination of Elden Ring for Best Narrative was met with a fair level of controversy. Elden Ring is not a game that holds your hand. It gives you nothing. Even the tutorial is hidden behind a few mysterious lines of text. At the start of the game, you are thrust into a beautiful open world. There are no quest logs, journals, or information to follow. The game has very little dialogue. Eventually, after wandering around, you will begin to piece together what you should be doing and where you should go. Then, you wander into Caelid. Twisting growths dominate the land under a blood-red sky. The very water is sickness, and enemies are mutated and massive. Something is different. Something has happened to this place. It is moments like this in which you, the player, make your own story, your own journey. Despite little direction and a vague story, Elden Ring tells a compelling narrative through its immaculate world building, player agency, and immersive environment. After exploring the world long enough, you will find new locations, items, and characters. Item descriptions shed light on the rich mythos George R.R. Martin wrote for the project, while foreshadowing events to come, emphasizing the player's role in uncovering the lore behind the lands between. Elden Ring walks away from the line tread for so long by what the industry refers to as narrative video games. Leaving behind cutscenes of exposition, dialogue, and a straight path forward, Elden Ring instead expands the possibilities of storytelling in video games by focusing on different narrative techniques unique to the medium. Broadly speaking, the discussion of narrative in storytelling often is conflated with literature and film. This narrow view traps many in an understanding of narrative bound by the constructions of these mediums, some of these being linearity, an allocentric viewing experience, and a passive engagement with the text. Elden Ring's deviation highlights new ways of using video games to tell stories, challenging the status quo for the video game narrative. In doing so, it also emphasizes distinct aspects of its medium. The purpose of this video is to define these aspects, and by doing so, widen the potential of narrative in video games. Narrative, in its most simple definition, is a story, but that does little to define the term or explain the human race's obsession to tell stories. As far back as we have records of civilization, we also have stories. There is something at the heart of an accounting of events or experiences, real or fictitious, that moves the human mind and soul. In her book, Storytelling in Video Games, The Art of the Digital Narrative, Amy M. Green states, "The desire to tell stories, to contextualize experience and extrapolate upon it across all possible genres, lies at the heart of what it means to be human. When tracing a trajectory that begins with cave paintings, moves through the oral tradition of storytelling, and ends with digital storytelling, one finds a wealth of human experiences considered, presented, debated, and shared in ways that transcend cultural boundaries and say something of fundamental importance about our shared concerns and humanity." Jonathan Goschel writes that story, whether delivered through films, books, or video games, teaches us facts about the world, influences our moral logic, and marks us with fears, hopes, and anxieties that alter our behavior, perhaps even our personalities. As Goschel states, stories exist to teach us about the world. Commonly, stories reflect the state of the times or offer a reflection on real events or history. Even if the story does not discuss history per se, an effective story will discuss something foundational to being human. Perhaps it challenges one's moral alignment by telling a story from an intimate perspective, or a character moves one in such a way they aspire to adopt the attributes of that character. The power of stories comes from their ability to interact with the real world, to explain it better while providing an outside view. The most effective stories are those that alter one's behavior, those that move the viewer to a point of change or enlightenment. Narrative is a symbolic measure to understand, address, and respond to the issues of everyday life. It is a tool, a box, to contain and explain the otherwise infinitely complex experience of life. In Barry Brummett's book, Rhetoric and Popular Culture, he builds extensively off the work of Kenneth Burke to explain the purpose of narrative genres. Burke takes the idea of genre a step further to argue that the standard classical genres of literature underlie all texts that one might encounter, even those of popular culture, and that those standard genres provide important but unsuspected equipment for living to their audiences. Burke argues that genres are developed and used as means to deal with differences and the accompanying guilt that comes with them. He posits that hierarchies, any structure or relationship based on rules or principles, are the main method for overcoming differences between people. You may go to church and organize yourself into the established structure of what it means to be a member of said church, or you may attend a sporting event, and by doing so, you follow the rules that make you a fan of the event. In doing so, you have overcome the separation that existed before joining the group. The same can be said for any relationship. However, the rules of hierarchies cannot always be followed, the result being a feeling of guilt and a return to that state of difference. Burke believes that a way of dealing with this guilt is through victimage. Victimage involves finding some other party that can represent one's guilt and then attacking the guilt in that form. For example, consider the genre of comedy, in which a comic fool commits a guilty act. This portrayal reveals the guilty act to all. The audience then understands that such an act is inherently human. In doing so, the viewer identifies the fool's guilt with their own, and simultaneously reintegrates into the hierarchy. The idea of victimage is closely linked with that of catharsis, or the process of releasing, and thereby providing relief from, strong or repressed emotions. The stage of a narrative allows those engaging in the narrative space to act out their guilt and their pent-up feelings. An effective narrative is an escape which safely causes one to reintegrate into both society and into their self. Having laid out the definition and importance of narrative, let's dive into the features of the medium and how these factors can influence narrative. A unique facet of the video game medium is point of view. I don't mean the positioning of the camera in the game itself, though these ideas are closely related. Rather, I mean the perspective of the player. Video games are simultaneously first-person and third-person experiences. Everything that you yourself do is in first person. We can call this point of view an egocentric perspective. Going to your job, getting a snack from your fridge, turning on your phone are all examples of first-person or egocentric experiences. When you watch someone or something else perform an action, you are engaging in a third-person experience. We can call this an allocentric perspective. Video games are unique in that they are both egocentric, you are the one controlling the character and taking actions, and allocentric, you are not actually the character, you are always watching the character from a distance. It is this dynamic of duality that creates the simulational experience so many enjoy. A 2022 study by the Department of Psychology, Neuroscience, and Behavior from McMaster University states the following on this dichotomy. It is not only the protagonist of the game who experiences an emotional journey during the game. The player does as well. However, the emotional journeys of the player and protagonist are invariably linked. The player experiences an emotional journey by playing as the protagonist, while the protagonist experiences an emotional journey in the story by being controlled by the player, similar to a puppeteer controlling the gestures of a puppet. The player's experience is thus a balance of ludic and narrative interests. This is similar to an actor who has to balance the performative task of being mindful of their stage environment, including their acting partners, with the narrative goal of conveying their character's emotional journey to an audience. If the goal of narrative is to present the human experience, then this actor-audience relationship allows for the player to engage on a deeper level. The lines between author and reader become blurred, opening room for creativity. There cannot be a passive player in a video game, though they may not choose to engage mentally with the material. However, there is a greater chance for the player to link themselves to the character they are acting as. This identification leads to greater capacity and potential for empathy. When the player successfully empathizes or immerses themselves in the character, they are undergoing victimage. This ability to perform actions by means of the puppet opens pathways for creativity, mental, and emotional exploration. The dual nature of allocentric and egocentric perspectives in the video game medium creates a quality of simulation. Every day in our real lives, we voluntarily perform mental simulations. When we are late for work or school, we have a number of options present. We can skip breakfast, not shower, drive safely, drive over the speed limit, run red lights, call ahead to our employer, or not go in at all. Some of these seem more reasonable than others, because when we think of a certain action, we simulate the consequences and mentally reload our last save file. Video games free the player from real consequences. Even if the game forces the player to live with the consequences of their actions, it is only really the avatar of the player that actually undergoes the consequence. Separated from their ego, their self, players are able to make choices freely, engaging in actions they otherwise would not or could not. Simulations in this way give the player agency. All games grant agency in some way or another to the player. Returning to storytelling in video games, the art of the digital narrative, Green writes, "The idea of agency works well on successively complex levels to describe the interactive relationship between game and player. On the most superficial level, the player has agency simply because he or she must opt to play the game and then continue to decide to complete the mechanical steps to make the game play out to its end. This may involve, for example, the physical manipulation of a game console's controller or a computer keyboard's buttons to advance the game. Certainly, games with a high level of player choice can empower a player within that fictive world. Thus, agency is, at its core, a descriptor used to denote power. That being said, throughout the playing of any video game, the player always has power, which can intensify in a game with high levels of player involvement in shaping the story, even when choices or actions are in actuality or have the appearance of being arbitrarily made at a given moment of gameplay. At the heart of the digital story, then, lies the player, as opposed to other storytelling mediums that may instead highlight their story's characters. Agency grants the player power, and agency is an inherent quality of games. This empowerment is also a result of achieving catharsis. When a player gets home from a long day at their job and loads up a first-person shooter such as Call of Duty, they are likely expressing repressed emotions they cannot relieve elsewhere. Feelings such as anger, competitiveness, and boredom can find an outlet. Through the projection of the player onto the character, we can see that the first-person shooter takes on a quality of a narrative. We should also understand all games as having a narrative in relation to the player as the protagonist. The game Super Mario Maker often is a story of an uphill battle against impossible odds, as players tackle challenging levels created by other players. In this story, feelings of triumph and frustration abound. This also explains why stories of incredible plays or gaming experiences are so often shared among friends. They are compelling narratives. The greater the amount of agency given to a player, the greater the power they hold. I believe that the success of a digital narrative is heavily influenced by this power. The more freedom and choice a player has, the more likely they are to identify with the virtual avatar. When this identification occurs, the pathway to empathy and emotional reward is open. Similarly, a player making free choices in the virtual world forces the link between the act and the player. Concerning victimage, the resulting guilt or other emotion is directly attached to the actor, the player. This kind of radical agency within video games often causes the plot, story, and gameplay to become nonlinear. In a player-centered story, the player also dictates the plot. This level of personalization is more likely to generate events and experiences that influence the player, because the player initiated and enacted them. It also opens up possibilities for unique and individual narratives, something no other medium can achieve. This is likely why titles such as Skyrim and Fallout have such popularity. They are vessels for the creativity and adventure of the player, giving them the freedom to go where they want and do what they want. Closely tied to agency is the idea of world building. Essential to the effectiveness of a game and therefore its narrative is a quality of escapism. This is often referred to as immersion. When a player is drawn into the world due to the success of its construction, the player becomes immersed. This is similar to the idea of projection mentioned earlier, in which the player overtakes the character, projecting their own moods, emotions, or mental state onto the character. The study discussed earlier touches on this briefly. The player performs actions in a game, but when these actions are being attributed to a character, the player is also performing the actions as the character, and thus play acting the role of the character. A hybridization between projection of the self and immersion into the character is therefore possible, as well as other varying relationships or non-relationships between avatar, character, and player. In addition, a video game player, similar to an actor, experiences a double consciousness in which she balances two states of mind, her own subjectivity and that of the character. Therefore, when we talk about character immersion, we must acknowledge that the player does not completely lose herself when immersing with the character. Synthesis between character and player is exaggerated when the world presents a believable illusion in which the hybrid player-character can exist. This is due to quality world building. The construction of a fictional or historical setting is a necessary element to any narrative medium. However, only in the virtual world is that setting able to be explored and lived in. World building in video games, as a result, can become the narrative itself. The non-player characters, the levels, the background, and the history all serve as fundamental aspects portraying some kind of human experience. Elden Ring's surprising success in achieving Best Narrative was not due to the strength of its plot and characters. It was revolutionary in telling a narrative through alternative means. Traditionally, the winners of Best Narrative have had lengthy cutscenes, lots of dialogue, and a somewhat linear story for the player to follow. This is understandable. It is similar to other mediums for narrative that existed much longer than the video game. This familiar structure is an easy way for players to feel the same emotions they would feel reading a good book or watching a powerful movie. Elden Ring challenged this preconceived notion of what a narrative should be. There are perhaps other richer ways to tell a story in a video game. Elden Ring's story is told primarily through world building, immersion, and agency. The environment is often the most compelling factor, not just scenic, but narrative in revealing the lore of the world. The player has to actively seek out knowledge of events and characters. When a revelation occurs, the player is rewarded for their interactivity and further connected to the emotions of the plot. The trials the protagonist faces are trials the player faces. Because of this, the greatest story beats tend to be when the player overcomes a challenge, beats a boss, or completes an objective. These are not just checklist items, these victories actively affect the world. Because of this, the player is empowered. Hidetaka Miyazaki, the creative mind behind Elden Ring, has stated how he often enjoyed reading English fantasy novels as a child. He was immersed by the foreign and fantastic setting of the worlds he read and pictured in his mind. Because he could not understand everything he read, he had to fill in the blanks with his own imagination. In his creation of Elden Ring, as well as his other projects, Miyazaki has simulated his own childhood experience. Little is given to the player, they must instead seek it out and fill in the blanks. In doing so, the player becomes an active participant and creator in the world. The narrative they construct is one that is ultimately personal and moving to them. It is a supreme escape into the repressed mind of the inner child. Understanding the aspects and characteristics of the video game medium, as well as its relation to narrative, hopefully causes more to appreciate Elden Ring for what it is. More importantly, this should serve as an intervention in how a narrative is told in the digital sphere. Perhaps with this knowledge, more compelling games can be designed that capitalize on the elements of simulation, agency, and immersion, allowing the player to simultaneously create and act within a story personal and meaningful to them.